Ah, the hype train. We promise ourselves every time it rolls into the station that we won't be suckered into buying a ticket, and yet all too often we still find ourselves sitting aboard, wondering how unclassy of us it would be to buy a Stella from the trolley at 11 AM. I mean, it's 5 o'clock somewhere, right? We'll take the lot! Alas, for every game we're excited for that ends up living up to our lofty expectations, there are probably a dozen more that leave us wishing we'd never bothered with them. And for our list today, we're looking at the titles of 2022 that were the biggest letdowns of the lot. Now, before we get to the entries, it's probably worth establishing what we mean by the most disappointing games of 2022. We want to be clear that the games featured on this list are not necessarily bad, but none of them were as good as we were hoping that they would be. It's also worth noting that these are our opinions, so please don't come for us if we felt a bit let down by a game that you really enjoyed. I'm Peter from TripleJump, and here are the 10 most disappointing games of 2022. Number 10. Ghostwire Tokyo. Here at Team TripleJump, we've come across loads of video games over the years that are all style and no substance. And perhaps the best example of this phenomenon from 2022 is Ghostwire Tokyo. In this timed exclusive for the PS5 and PC, players are given the ability to use psychic and paranormal abilities to defeat the many ghouls and ghosties that haunt Tokyo. On paper, this sounds like it could be a great deal of fun, but an unwillingness on the part of the devs to push the envelope has prevented Ghostwire Tokyo from achieving greatness. A number of publications commented that some of the gameplay feels a little antiquated, and in particular, they felt the combat was overly simplistic and the protagonist's movements seemed slow and imprecise. Many also found the game to be quite repetitive, and although the premise may sound cool, in practice, there's nothing really innovative to be found. Those looking for a bit of mindless ghost hunting fun or a game that looks very pretty would probably enjoy their time with Ghostwire Tokyo, but anyone after something with a little more substance would be better off ghosting this particular offering. Number 9. As Dusk Falls. It makes us a little sad to have put As Dusk Falls on this list, as for the most part, it's a pretty good game. The art style's interesting and pleasing to the eye, the choices given to the players actually have some weight to them, and the story is compelling. Regrettably though, developer Interior Night really beefed the ending. As Dusk Falls is split into two distinct parts, or books as they're known in the game. The first book focuses on a hostage situation at a motel in a desert, whilst the second presents the aftermath of the event. The first couple of chapters of Book 1 are gripping, keeping players on the edge of their seats for the duration. However, things start to go downhill during Chapter 3. Firstly, a trigger warning basically spoils what's going to happen, so players are no longer surprised when it does. We support the warning, of course, but feel it could have been better placed, you know? Secondly, the pacing of the story takes a severe hit as flashbacks are inserted at inopportune moments, and rather than adding to the story, they just yank players out of the action. So in summary, As Dusk Falls gets off to a great start, but fails to stick the landing. Number 8. Scorn. If you're a fan of horror, you'll know that genuine spooks are hard to come by, as it takes a lot of work to frighten an audience, especially today. Sadly, some game developers seem to be under the impression that gross and scary are synonymous with one another, and it's for that reason that we end up with titles like Scorn. First announced in 2014, Scorn is described as an atmospheric first-person horror adventure game set in a nightmarish universe of odd forms and somber tapestry. The idea is that players are thrown into the world with little context in order to create feelings of isolation. However, what most players will feel is some combination of confusion and revulsion. In fairness to Scorn, its HR Giga-inspired visuals are incredibly impressive, and for a time at least, they are quite unsettling. The issue, though, is that they're constant, and so after a while, the player becomes numb to them. We've discussed this problem before in reference to titles like Agony, because the trouble is, if everything is at 100 all of the time, it might as well be at 0 all of the time. The game does have a couple of cool puzzles, but most of its runtime is taken up by aimlessly wandering around, grim-looking but not very scary corridors. Number 7. New Tales from the Borderlands. Telltale Games was one of the finest developers in the world when it came to narrative-driven video games. But sadly, they were forced to close their doors in 2018. For a while, it looked like we'd have to live the rest of our lives without getting to experience follow-ups to the likes of The Wolf Among Us and Tales from the Borderlands, but recently the mantle has been picked up by other developers, and so it would seem that not all is completely lost. With that said, the revival doesn't seem to be off to the best start, and although we were rather excited for new Tales from the Borderlands, that excitement soon wore off when we actually got to play the thing. The first Tales from the Borderlands title received critical acclaim, with reviewers praising everything from its story, humor, and likable characters to its art style and choice-driven gameplay. Whilst new Tales from the Borderlands looks quite nice, critics couldn't really find much to love. The characters are irritating, the decisions made by players feel like they don't really matter, and the Borderlands series humor is almost entirely absent. Huh, new Tales from the Borderlands? More like new fails from the Borderlands. Number 6. Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2: The Sith Lords Switch port. The OG KOTOR, first released in 2003, is considered to be one of the greatest games of all time. Sadly, although its sequel, Knights of the Old Republic 2: The Sith Lords, was pretty good, thanks to a rushed development, it was buggier than a Bush-Tucker trial, and much of its content ended up on the cutting room floor. So, with all that in mind, when a port for the Nintendo Switch was announced in May 2022, fans of the series rejoiced. Surely, they probably thought to themselves, the developers will take this opportunity to fix the issues and reinstate the missing content. They did not. They didn't do that at all. Indeed, upon its release in June 2022, players found that all of the problems that plagued the original were still present in the port. Some more minor problems could be overlooked, but those that caused the game to constantly crash were not so easily swept under the rug. A patch was released in July 2022 that addressed some of the issues, but KOTOR 2 is still far from perfect. According to Aspire, DLC for the game, which was set to include new missions and a revamped ending, would be released by the third quarter of 2022, but that deadline has passed, and at time of recording, the studio has gone eerily quiet on the matter. Oh dear. Number 5. Gotham Knights. Prior to its release in October 2022, we here at Team TripleJump were pretty gosh darned excited about Gotham Knights, an open-world action RPG set in the Batman universe where you get to play as one of 4 non-Bruce Wayne characters and fight goons and supervillains. Sign us the flip up! Alas, we were once again victims of hype, as Gotham Knights failed to live up to our expectations. Now don't get us wrong, Gotham Knights isn't the worst video game ever made, but it is pretty dull. The co-op gameplay received some praise from critics, as did the 4 playable characters, but aside from that, the compliments were few and far between. The main problem that both players and critics had with Gotham Knights was the fact that it feels so grindy. Many of the mission objectives are very similar, and so after a while, players just feel like they're doing the same thing over and over, and the story isn't anything to write home about either. So, if you're suffering from insomnia and are looking for a game that will put you to sleep, then you'll probably quite like Gotham Knights. If you're after an exciting and engaging experience, though, you're probably better off going back and, just replaying the Arkham trilogy. Enjoy. Number 4. Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. There's something to be said for giving people more of what they love. After all, if you really enjoyed one slice of cake, you'll definitely enjoy a second, correct? Clearly this is the line of thinking that resulted in Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, a game that came to be after the stellar audience reception to the Borderlands 2 DLC, Tiny Tina's Assault on Dragon Keep. Prior to its release, Tiny Tina's Wonderlands looked to have all of the necessary ingredients to make a good game. A returning fan-favorite character, Borderlands trademark graphics, an all-star cast, and of course, D&D. However, when players finally got their hands on Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, many were unimpressed. The story lacks the soul and emotion of Assault on Dragon Keep, the gameplay is fun at first, but quickly becomes repetitive, and the talents of the voice cast are largely squandered. The game is by no means terrible, and players who go in just looking for some mindless, colourful violence will probably find it more than acceptable, but those of us who'd been really looking forward to it have been left feeling like we've rolled a natural one. Number 3. Nintendo Switch Sports. When Nintendo Switch Sports, a game that was touted to be Wii Sports but for the Switch, was announced in February 2022, fans of digital tennis and bowling celebrated. Finally, an opportunity to revisit those heady days of flailing our arms about and accidentally wedging controllers into our TV screens. Nintendo Switch Sports was released in April 2022, and well, it's a bit naff. The game comes with 6 sports, 3 from previous sports installments, i.e. tennis, bowling, and swordplay, as well as soccer, volleyball, and badminton. To jump in, all players need to do is wield the Joy-Con as they would in real sports, and simulate the correct motions. So far so good, and from a critical standpoint, it's only 4% less good than its forefather, so why do we all feel so let down by it? The reasons given for its middling review scores were the less than stellar motion controls, the game's heavy reliance on online play, and an overall lack of content. Still, 2 out of 3 of these complaints could probably also have been leveled at Wii Sports, so I think it's fairly safe to say that nostalgia played a large role in assuring our disappointment here. Number 2. Overwatch 2. Oh, Blizzard, every time we think you can't possibly let us down any further, you promptly proceed to do so. First, there was the announcement of Diablo Immortal, which went down so badly at BlizzCon 2018 that it led to one of the most iconic moments in video game history. Then, there was the really bad thing, and now, as if to complete the trifecta of terribleness, there's Overwatch 2. Now, we're fully aware that the studio doesn't intend to keep Overwatch 2 in its current state, but as things stand, it's basically just Overwatch, but with extra microtransactions. Upon first glance, the game barely looks any different to its predecessor, but once the gameplay begins, the game still barely looks any different to its predecessor. Sure, there are a couple of extra heroes to play with, 1 or 2 new gameplay modes, and a shift to 5-on-5 matches as opposed to the 6-on-6 model of the previous game, but there's no content as of yet that makes it feel like an entire new game was actually warranted. Hopefully, once the PvE and story modes launch, Overwatch 2 will be worth a look, but as it stands, it feels more like a big patch than a standalone title. And number 1, Saints Row. If you've played Saints Row 4, you'll know that the game is absolutely insane. The story takes place after the boss has become the President of the United States and tells of the Saints' struggle against alien invaders that have trapped Earth's best and brightest in a simulation and destroyed the planet. The issue was that, from there, developer Volition was kind of left with nowhere else to go. After all, it's hard to go bigger than blowing up Earth, and so for the next game in the Saints Row series, the decision was made to do a reboot rather than trying to top the wackiness of 4. Big mistake. The main issue with 2022's Saints Row, aside from the fact it has the same title as the first game in the series and is therefore going to be super confusing for the rest of history, is that it leans too far away from the franchise's trademark zany humor. In addition to this, many critics felt the gameplay has failed to evolve since the release of 4, plus the game was absolutely jam-packed with glitches. As a standalone title, Saints Row would be a middling open-world action-adventure, but as a Saints Row game, it feels like a real swing and a miss.